The aim of this video is to help you think about Whitechapel and to think about housing and accommodation and how this links with poverty and how this links with crime as well. So by going over the details of housing and accommodation, you can then obviously have things to back up key features questions, and we're also going to look at some sources which will be useful to help give you more information for the detail in the source question. One of the major themes when studying Whitechapel is poverty and how all the circumstances end up colliding in Whitechapel, and this is the melting pot and shows us the main experiences of those living in the slums in London. Now you can see here what the specification is asking you to do, and this video is going to focus on accommodation and thinking about what accommodation meant for poverty and how this put people into a cycle of poverty. Did it help support get them out of poverty? So you'll see we've got to look at the local context of Whitechapel, look at the different types of accommodation and the help available for the poor, the presence of lodging houses and what this means for the population and migration, linked with crime specifically, and the organisation of police and the problems that this would create for the police. So to put everything into context then as to why there is such huge poverty at this time. In 1873, there's a global financial crisis, which led to an economic downturn and a 20-year slump. Now, Britain wasn't used to this. It had been at the forefront of the Industrial Revolution, so lots of towns and cities had developed. People had moved away from the countryside, so couldn't actually grow their own food. Machines had replaced their work, so lots of people were no longer able to do the cheap manual labour. Obviously, industrialists were looking to make their expenses cheaper. This meant there were many people living in cities when a recession hit, with high unemployment, low wages, and 1 million people being out of work across the whole country, which obviously increases the crime rates as people needed to steal to survive. In the meantime, in Europe, the Russian Tsar is putting in place many restrictive laws targeting the Jewish population. Alexander III's May laws lasted 30 years, and the Jews were restricted from living in certain places, trading on a Sunday, having specific jobs. Pogroms saw their homes and villages violently attacked by Russian people, meaning that this left Jews with no option but to leave Russia and emigrate across Europe looking for a peaceful living situation. A large number appeared in Whitechapel on their way to America and settled, speaking no English and being exploited often by the situation they found themselves in. Closer to home, there were troubles in Ireland. The Irish wanted to rule themselves in something called Home Rule. There was massive famine as well, and Irish nationalists were agitating. That means they were causing trouble to get the government to give in and allow them for the Irish to rule Ireland. So this saw many harsh measures put in place, and famine was extreme. Many Irish had to leave Ireland and aimed for America, but like the Jews, they needed to earn money for their passage, and a large population settled in Whitechapel. This is why the exam board has selected Whitechapel, because it's a prime example of all the different problems that there were in poverty, and also thinking about all the kind of melting pot that there was in Whitechapel for slum living. The East End of London has been heavily linked to the Industrial Revolution, with the docks providing many with work. Immigrants arrived here and stayed as there was work. In these areas there's a growth of slums with many living in overcrowded and unsanitary conditions. Pollution was high, toxic waste from the factories around the river and polluting ships meant that toxic fogs are created and caused health problems, leading to more people not being able to work. Whitechapel itself has a population of about 30,000 people, and approximately 1,000 of those are homeless. Theft is common for survival, and people drink to forget their problems, and the streets are violent and unsafe. Whitechapel has little healthy drinking water, so people rely upon drinking ale. Sewers run into the streets and into the Thames. Adding all of the conditions together, combined with the attitude of the Victorian wealthy, who believed the poor were only poor because they were lazy, and any help they were given would encourage them to be idle and try and not look for work. Life expectancy in the slums is as low as 43, and in some areas is as low as 28. Infant mortality is high, so it's highly unlikely that this is a place where you're going to survive. Out of the 5 bullet points, you'll see that housing is a common theme. It appears in 3 of the 5 bullet points of the specification and focuses upon the problems caused by it and as a result of it. Now, I'm not going to read you out the different things, so you will need to pause and have a look at what's on the screen in front of you. Accommodation can be split into a number of categories: permanent and temporary, and those which were designed to help the poor. There were 30,709 residents in Whitechapel, to be specific, in 1881, and only 4,069 occupied houses. The different type of houses include things like rookeries, those are the slums, lodging and doss houses, those are the temporary accommodation, sweatshops, help for the poor available in the workhouses with casual and permanent wards, Dr. Barnardo's orphanages, and the Peabody estate when the government start to step in and we get slum clearance. Rookeries were houses which were divided up into rooms, and these rooms divided up again and they were let out as apartments. There's really poor ventilation. People would live, work and sleep in their small space. These were permanent accommodation and you needed a regular income to be able to pay the rent, but you were often exploited by corrupt landlords. These slums were recognised to be hotbeds of crime. Now, Thomas Beames, a clergyman, decides to investigate the typical living conditions, and he wrote a memoir called The Rookeries of London, and witnesses the dire conditions of poverty of inner city London. He drew on eyewitness accounts and argued that the environment had a direct impact on your education, lifestyle and crime. The whole point of this was to get the government to start looking at these conditions. Now, you'll see there's some specific facts there linked with rookeries to do with how many people there would be in one specific rookery of 123 rooms, when there are 757 people actually living in that building. The buildings were cramped. There's tight alleyways in between the rookeries, which meant that criminals could often evade the police because they knew their way round the different alleyways that were connecting these rookeries together. These houses are specifically linked to policing, and they are the temporary accommodation. So you would rent a number of hours in these places. They were known to house violent criminals, sex workers and drunks. Streets housing the lodging houses were notorious, could be ruled by gangs, and were places the police often did not go. Criminals would not have permanent housing, so it would be difficult to track them. But despite this, people felt safer in these than actually sleeping on the streets. And you'll see that the victims of Jack the Ripper often tried to earn money overnight to make sure that they could sleep inside overnight rather than having to sleep on the streets, which were an incredibly dangerous place. Now, a quarter of Whitechapel's population actually lived in these, so it means it's very hard to track them. And you'll see some facts that are on the screen in front of you. In 1886, another memoir was written about this by Howard Goldsmith. He publishes a book called Dotings of a Dosser, where he wants to highlight the living conditions, as he said they're worse than those published in any newspaper. And you'll see in your textbook on page 144, there's a source which is actually from his book. There are specific Jewish lodging houses, and this causes tensions against the community as people feel they're looking after their own and immigrants are taking their jobs and having better accommodation than the lodging houses that are available to them. Now, in practice, this isn't true. Many are exploited, paid low wages, living in sweatshops and living in extreme poverty as well, all with the added disadvantage of not being able to speak the language, so finding it incredibly difficult to move on. People in Whitechapel often worked in things called the sweated trade, so they're working in sweatshops. So this is tailoring, shoemaking, things like that, where people were exploited for poor wages. They often had to work like 20-hour shifts in small unventilated rooms, often ending up sleeping there for very low wages as well. So the people of Whitechapel feel that immigrants are taking their jobs and homes, which isn't always the case, because obviously immigrants ended up often living and working in these sweatshops and their health suffer as a consequence of this. Now, the 4-mark detail in the source question, which is at the end of the Whitechapel section, will ask you to look at another source to help pick up on an issue and help to expand upon an issue or answer a question that you have from the source that it's asked you to look at. Now, often with accommodation, you can bring in things like Charles Booth's poverty maps. And I've put reasons why it's useful, what it will help you to do, but also limitations in case you get the how useful question and you get something like this on there. So, often Charles Booth's poverty maps are linked with crime, poverty and accommodation. The red areas represent the middle classes and well-to-do, and you can see that that's down the main shopping centres, the main high street of Whitechapel. The dark blue represent the very poor, the chronically poor, and the black represents semi-criminal, and you can see that that's all tightly packed around the shopping centre streets. Now, another useful source for you is a memoir, and it's by Thomas Beames and is called Rookeries of London. Now, this was particularly useful because it was giving eyewitness accounts to the slums, and he had a very clear purpose. He wanted the government to help out. Beames describes the place as a dirtier or more wretched place he had never seen. The street was very narrow and muddy. The air was impregnated with filthy odours. So you can find some memoirs. They won't be from the poor, but they are taking eyewitness accounts. And again, often you'll find maybe things in court records where people are giving witness statements about something that might have happened on the streets. But this would be a particularly useful one to memorise if you're thinking about accommodation and finding about the poor situation that people lived in. Right, so a very useful source then is the census. Great information to build a picture of overcrowding, types of housing, ages of people, their occupations. It only happens every 10 years though. So we obviously have 1871, 1881, 1891 and 1901. It can only tell you who's there on that date and not their general conditions or whether they've committed any crimes. So often with the lodging houses, this will be a big problem because obviously if they're not there when the person comes round, then you won't be able to kind of keep an eye on the amount of homeless people and where they're living. Another useful memoir is something called Howard Goldsmith's Dotings of a Dosser in 1886, and he aims to tell people about living conditions which are worse than have actually been described in any newspaper. Now, the actual source is on page 144 of your textbook, and you can read an extract of how he's described the lodging houses and their circumstances. So that's really useful in being able to find out accounts of lodging houses and what it was like to live in a lodging house. But you would need to give the very specific name of the book rather than just saying a memoir about lodging houses. Okay, you need to give Dotings of a Dosser by Howard Goldsmith. Now, another useful book which has come up as part of the sources in on the Whitechapel section of the paper is People of the Abyss by Jack London. Now, it was a first-hand account of living in Whitechapel slums in 1902, but obviously he's calling it the abyss. He's deliberately doing it to shock. He's thinking about the hellish situations, but it very much will give another eyewitness account of what it's like and the kind of crimes, the overcrowding, the situation, the unhygienic nature of living in the slums. So there is some help available for the poor, and we're going to look at the accommodation situation that's trying to better the lives of the poor. So a key features question has come up on workhouses in the past. Now, help is available, but the aim is to keep costs down by putting poor people off entering the workhouse. So this should be their last resort. So this shows you back to those Victorian values of they felt that any help would encourage people to be idle and lazy. So this is an incredibly humiliating experience, and there's lots of evidence of the poor trying to avoid going into the workhouse. The amount of people that live in lodging houses, for example. And there was a huge stigma attached to having lived in a workhouse, and it brought shame upon you for the rest of your life. So people very much tried to avoid this. They had to actually go and plead their case in front of a board of middle-aged men who asked very humiliating questions, and questions are asked to work out people's moral character, and you're divided into deserving and undeserving poor. You have to wear a uniform, families are split, and tough manual labour is linked to things like prisons with stone breaking, oakum picking, that unpicking the rope from the big ships, food preparation, laundry, some really horrible, tough work. Okay, and you had to prove that you had somewhere to go and you had the right kind of wealth to support yourself to get out of the workhouse. Now for us, we can see admissions and discharge records, and they can give you the name, age of the person, marital status, occupation, their prior address and whether they could work or not. You could probably look at discharge records to see how long people have been in the workhouse. And there was obviously permanent residence. There's an infirmary that's going to help the sick, but often you'll find the cemeteries are very close to the hospital and the workhouse because obviously people end up going in there to die. There were casual wards. These are for 1 to 2 nights, and they are kept away from inmates. Yes, people were called inmates, which shows the link with prisons. They would need to stay and work off their board the next day, but some workhouses were quite good in relation to allowing people to move on. But that's kind of newer work by Haley Rubentold in the 5. You would, like I said, often need to stay to do work and work off your board and lodgings the next day, which meant that then you struggled to find money for the next night to find yourself accommodation. So people tried to avoid this. You may see a picture of people queued outside for help. And one of Jack the Ripper's victims, Polly Nichols, can be tracked in her journey through London through casual ward workhouse records. And her character reference was given by one of her workhouse inmates, saying that actually she wasn't a fast lady, she wasn't a prostitute. So the workhouses were there to help the poor, but these are not nice places. Someone else in the specification who hasn't actually had a question asked upon them was the Dr. Bernardo orphanages. Now, Dr. Bernardo was a doctor who trained around Whitechapel in the slums and had set up a school for children whose parents died in the outbreak of infectious disease. And one of his students took him up to the rooftops of London and showed him how street children would try and actually avoid going to the workhouse by living there. So it kind of links a lot with Charles Dickens and Fagin's gangs and children being schooled in a life of crime and kind of living in certain areas. So he tried to obviously avoid this and ended up setting up boys' homes and then later on a girls' home as well, and ends up with 100 of these across the country nationally to basically improve children's start in life, to give them an education. Now, a boy was actually turned away from the Dr. Bernardo's house and was found dead 2 days later. So that kind of led to their motto, which says no destitute child ever refused admission. And this was their new policy, which meant that any children could get help. Admissions records from here can show you the circumstances leading to the child's admission, any birth and baptism records that are available, school reports from when they were within that, and perhaps photos of them as well, which might be quite useful. But as you can see in this photo, it's a very staged photo as well of the help that is available for the poor. Now, all the information that you need about the Peabody estate is on these slides. The big thing about the Peabody estate was that this was linked to the Artisans' Dwellings Act, which was linked with slum clearance, so getting rid of the rookeries and improving the living conditions of the poor, because obviously that would then help to reduce crime rates. So if you think about it, every time the government has done something or made a change, it's because they're trying to improve crime rates. So they are clearing the slums where people live and they are making affordable housing. And you'll see here that there's lots of detail about ventilation between blocks, laundries being available, facilities being available. They often had shops on the ground floor as well, but you had to be of good moral character to live there. And actually one of Jack the Ripper's victims ended up losing her family because she was an alcoholic, and she was kicked out of the Peabody estate. But you'll see that they had proper plaster on the walls, they had proper sewage in these places, and I've got the prices there that you could rent a 1-room flat, a 2-room flat or a 3-room flat. And this was, you had to be in work. So this was encouraging the poor to help themselves and was providing much better accommodation for people. And you can see that that starts in earnest in 1875. But don't forget, this takes time. There are 11 blocks here and a lot of rookeries and a lot of exploitative landlords are still out there. A key features question on accommodation will probably link it to poverty or crime or the problems of policing, but think about things like permanent accommodation and the types of problems that cause with overcrowding, spread of disease, enabling criminals to hide, being exploited by their landlords as well. You could think about the number of permanent houses that there actually were, or the number of people that there were in Whitechapel versus the number of permanent houses that there were, and obviously link it with sources like the census would be quite useful. Temporary housing is often linked with the high crime rates and the idea that police wouldn't go down certain streets like Dorset Street. Obviously we had other streets as well which were particularly violent, and in those doss houses or lodging houses you had kind of the criminals of London managing to hide out and also perpetual violence being encouraged. We also have this as evidence of Victorian values with the workhouse, this idea of the poor being idle and lazy. So the idea that the workhouse should only be for the poorest of the poor and below the lowest labourer's house, so that it didn't encourage people to be idle and lazy, because if you're giving them help, they're not looking for work. And finally, another kind of area that there is to help is philanthropy. There was some help for the poor in housing. So for children, the Dr. Bernardo's children houses and looking at improving their lives with education. The same with the Peabody Estates after the Artisans Dwelling Act and slum clearance. They're looking at providing decent accommodation for people because they then believe that that will help with poverty and with the crime rates as well.